It's been about a week and a half or so since Winter Storm Riley came through, and we were out of power for a few days, and it's been snowing ever since.
Yeah, we're all set to do another video for you guys today, and it's snowed again.
Yep.
And again.
So we just want to continue to talk about how to be prepared for emergencies as the snow continues to come down.
I gotta admit, it's beautiful.
Yeah. It's like the end of March and it's still cold.
I know. I gotta admit, spring's gonna be pretty amazing this year.
Yep. Let's go inside.
Yeah, let's go inside. Okay.
Tiny House Prepper. Hey there everybody, I'm Bill.
And I'm Elizabeth with Tiny House Prepper.
And what we want to talk about today, we want to continue talking about prepping for emergencies, but we want to talk about the difference between short-term or prepping for short-term emergencies and prepping for long-term emergencies.
Right.
Because it's really a completely different scenario and a completely different way to be able to prepare for those two things.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it is. It is. You know, on the short term, we've just had the electricity go out because there was all this, the heavy snow with a lot of blowing, you know, really bad wind with the nor'easter, hurricanes, all sorts of different kinds of storms. People have situations with electricity going out because of earthquakes. I mean, there's a lot of different scenarios that people deal with all the time in terms of short-term emergency situations where it's going to get back on its feet again. It may take a little bit, but it'll, you know, everything will get back on its feet. It's just a matter of making it through that. And I tell you, with the hurricanes and stuff, some people have had some pretty rough times trying to just hang in there. Until, you know, help can come. And I know for poor Puerto Rico, it's still rough.
Still a mess, yeah, from the hurricane months ago.
Right.
You know, most people, if they have a short-term emergency because of a storm, they don't have power for a few days or something like that. I would consider short-term to be up to maybe 7 to 10 days. But even beyond that, if a storm, if it's really bad, hurricane can go much longer than that.
As people have seen.
Right. But
Absolutely.
what we're talking about here when we say short term, we're talking about maybe a week where you have no power or, you know, whatever, the emergency.
And that can be too, you know, a week to 10 days where even your infrastructure around you is still not together yet.
Yeah.
Gas stations don't have electricity, or stores have problems, or there's no access.
Right.
So, you know, it can be a situation of just not having the things around you to be able to get to.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So then we have long term. And what are we talking about here? Basically anything more than about 7 to 10 days, but it could be anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months to a year or more. And what kind of things would cause that?
Right.
I think there are a number of things, but the primary thing that could cause a long-term emergency situation like that is some kind of a financial collapse. I truly believe that we have an imminent collapse of the dollar coming because of the federal deficit. It just simply cannot be sustained. It's now so large that we as a nation will never be able to pay it back. And it continues to grow, and I just see a complete collapse of the dollar. And if that happens, we're so interconnected on the world's, you know,
The whole financial scenario.
that it could possibly be a worldwide financial collapse, and something like that could take anywhere from a couple months to a year or more to reestablish the whole system, financial system, and getting up and going again.
And this isn't just this could happen. I mean, it has happened in, you know, different places, different countries, in terms of what they call hyperinflation. What was it we've probably mentioned this before, but when we were living in Germany, we got our hands on how many Deutschmark bill was that? 2 million Deutschmarks?
Yeah, we had, you know, I went to an antique store and found a 2 million Deutschmark bill.
and it was not printed on the back because the ink was too expensive to print both sides.
Right.
And so basically, you could take a wheelbarrow of money and it wouldn't necessarily buy you a loaf of bread. And that had happened in Argentina. I mean, I know of different places. So sometimes when the money collapses, you have to realize that until things get stabilized again, your money doesn't have any value anymore.
Right, and you can't buy anything. And then all of a sudden there's nothing available because the trucks can't buy the diesel fuel that they need to get the stuff to the store, and everything just totally collapses.
We're very interconnected. Oh my goodness, especially the trucking industry is so vital to every single thing we ever do in our life. And that's not because Bill's been a truck driver. I mean, it's just the truth of it that they transport everything. Mm-hmm. And so they need fuel, and they need to be able to have the money to keep working.
So that's the primary reason that I would see for a long-term prepping situation. The others are, terrorist attacks or EMP attacks, that sort of thing, or, nuclear holocaust. But then you're getting into the doomsday prepper thing, and that's certainly a possibility, but that's not where we're headed. That's not what we believe is happening.
Well, yeah, that's not something we get really shook about. But it, just things can happen where our normal ability to have electricity and funding and all this kind of stuff could be messed up for a period of time.
Right.
And that long-term preparation.
Now, in our thinking, in our planning, in our preparation, we are planning for a long-term, what we call end-of-the-world scenario. That's sort of tongue-in-cheek,
Yeah,
but we call it the EOW, the end of the world.
That's a whole lot better than the other one that people say all the time.
So that's, in our thinking, in our planning, that's where we're headed, planning for a long-term EOW event.
Well, because that way, no matter what happens, you feel like you at least have done some preparation for the important things.
Now, we did a video last week right after the storm. It was called What We Learned During Winter Storm Riley.
Yeah.
And we told you some of the things that we learned and some of the things that didn't work so well. And we got lots and lots of comments, hundreds of comments of suggestions of how we could take care of things and how we could do things better. And we really appreciate all of that.
Really appreciate people care enough to put input into it and to share with each other.
Right.
We really do appreciate it very, very much, all the interaction.
However, probably 90% of the comments and suggestions that we got were suggestions for short-term planning, for short-term emergencies.
And they're good suggestions.
Yes.
Well, what we're trying to do today is try to really show how you should, suggestions like this, are they practical, I guess what I'm trying to say, for a more long-term situation.
Now, we'll go through some of these in a minute, but like I said, they were very helpful. We really appreciate that. They were almost all exclusively short-term preps. And like I said earlier, in our mentality, we are going for more of the long-term scenario. And so quite frankly, we didn't do a lot of the short-term prepping that we should have, knowing that a storm is coming up. We should have prepared in a different way. But I wanted to test our long-term prep system and see what would happen if all of a sudden we have an emergency coming up.
Well, in fact, you just brought up a really good point, sweetheart. One of the things that is generally a difference between a short-term situation and potentially a long-term situation is whether or not you get any warning.
Right. That's where I was just headed.
Well, you just go right there.
A storm's coming up, you're going to have a couple days warning. Typically in a long-term financial collapse, you're not going to have any warning. In 1929, the collapse of the stock market that set off the Great Depression, there was no warning. All of a sudden, the stock market just collapsed within a day or two and shut down, and everything changed overnight.
Well, people got up in the morning and the banks were closed.
Right.
They started, trying to do runs in the banks.
Recently, I don't know, it was a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, something like that, there were some major financial issues in Greece. And everybody in the country woke up on a Monday morning and found out that all the banks were closed. I guess by order of the government, they were all closed. And then I didn't completely understand what happened, but the government skimmed something off of the top of everybody's bank accounts, a certain percentage just right off the top to help keep the government solvent. And then it was like, I think within a week or so, all the banks opened up again. But my point is, they had a financial situation, the government came in and closed all the banks. Nobody had any warning at all. So in a major financial collapse, it could happen overnight and you don't have any warning. So, I wanted to go into this and test our long-term prepper system without any warning and see what happened. Well, it turns out there were some short-term things that we should have done since we had some warning,
Right.
but we didn't because we were testing our long-term system. So is that making sense? I hope that makes sense.
Well, and we tend to want to know we're going to be able to rely on those long-term systems.
Right. So, a lot of people really have a handle on what to do for short-term preparedness if they know a storm is coming.
Right, or yeah, they know
And
something's
these
coming.
are a lot of the things that you guys suggested to us. What?
Oh yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, I just...
Things like stocking up on groceries. If you don't have a long-term food storage like we do with our Thrive Life freeze-dried food, then you're going to run to the grocery store and stock up on groceries if you know a storm's coming. This is what leads to the grocery store shelves being stripped bare the night before the storm.
Yeah, if everybody's stocking up and you
That's
can't
one-
find a roll of toilet paper.
That's one thing that we're trying to avoid, and in fact we did. We didn't even give second thought to our food because we have plenty. Another thing that many of you mentioned is filling up water containers. Like I talked about, we don't really have room to store long-term water storage. We just simply don't have the room because we live in 250 square feet of this tiny little, RV tiny house. But we could have stocked up. A lot of you mentioned by different names. It's a plastic or a rubber bladder that goes into your tub, and you can fill it up with water, and you can fit a lot of water in there. We could have filled up all of our pots and pans and stored as much water as we could.
You just to do the initial so we would initially have
Right.
water and yeah.
Now, once again, I mentioned that was a fail on our part because we weren't thinking short term, we were thinking long term. If we had done that, then water would not have been a concern, at least on the short term. If it turned into 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, then that kind of prepping for water wouldn't have been good, and then we'd be going down to the river to use our water filter system, which is our long-term emergency water supply.
Well, and in our situation, we know that our pump here has a generator on it.
Right.
But the storm was pretty rough while it was happening. In fact, we're still very impressed that whoever got down there and got it going did it in the blowing and the snowing and the winding and all that stuff. But so we knew that there's a good chance water was going to come back on. But it would have been good to have water, just for initial, to have more ahead, just until that could even get kicked in.
Right.
We realized that. We should have made sure of that.
Now, we actually got quite a number of people making comments that they were very concerned about us going out into that blizzard, especially at night, to get water from the river. That it would be very dangerous to do that. And I agree.
Absolutely.
And I certainly would not have done that. The blizzard was bad, but we knew that it was going to be over the next day. And we certainly didn't have to get emergency water within the next 12 or 18 hours.
Right.
We would have waited until the storm was over for me to go down and get water from the river if we had to do that. And in fact, the next day was a beautiful sunny day, and it would have been fine to do that.
Lots of snow, but it was a beautiful
but-
day.
Several days after that storm, we had another storm that it snowed all day, and it dumped about 8 inches of snow. And just for those of you in the south who really, down there, you have 3 inches and it shuts your whole town down. Let me show you a little clip that I took after that 8-inch storm to show you what it's like up here in the north when it snows. So this is the next storm, 3 days after the one that knocked our power out. And for our friends in the south, I just want to show you something. Today it snowed all day long, just stopped snowing about a half hour ago. It snowed 8 inches. I just finished clearing my driveway and I get out on the roads half hour after the storm's over, and you see that the roads are clear. I went to the post office, I went to a red box to return some movies. All the parking lots are cleared as well. This is how we handle the snow in the north, because we got dozens of snow plows per county. Down there in the south, you only got 1 or 2, because that's all you need. You just don't have snow very often. We take snow removal seriously up here, otherwise our entire economy would stop, because we get big snowstorms, sometimes weekly. So welcome to the north. And even this road, this is a little dead-end road that we live at the end of, and there's only a few houses back here, and it's already been plowed. We used to live in Southern Virginia, and a road like this would take a week to be plowed down there. But here it's plowed during the snowstorm, even for just a few houses that are back here, including us. Okay, so there you see we had 8 inches of snow during the day, and they were of course plowing while it was snowing. And a half hour after the snow stopped, I went out, and you see that the roads were all clear. So as long as it's a short-term situation, and the snow plows have gasoline or diesel or whatever they burn, it would have been fine for me to take the bicycle down to the river, the next day to get water, because the roads were all virtually clear.
You could probably have taken the car down to the river.
Yeah, that's true. I could have taken the car down. You're absolutely right. What am I thinking?
If they can plow the roads, well, we can drive the car.
Yeah. But in a long-term situation where the plows couldn't get gasoline, then I would be, using the bicycle if the roads were clear, or that's where we realize I need to get a sled so that I can get down there and get water if the roads are not plowed. But if the roads are not plowed, then people are not going to be out on them anyway, so it's not going to be a dangerous situation. And of course I would have done it during the day, not in the overnight in the middle of a blizzard.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Some of you asked about, well, how are you going to get water from the river when the river's frozen over? Well, we did a video about that, and I'll put a link to at the end of this about testing our emergency water system. But the river has a section of rapids that never freezes, even when it's 10 below, and we can get water
And
there.
they're accessible.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, okay. Another thing that a lot of people suggested was to get a generator. A couple of people suggested that we have a snowmobile to get to the river, to get the water. Both of those things take gasoline, which on a short term, you can plan for that. You can fill them up. You can have some, gas cans full. But in a long-term situation, that gasoline's only going to last so long, and then it's going to be done.
We're so vulnerable to electricity. You could have huge tanks full of gas close by, but unless you got the pumps to pump it, it's not.
Right.
It's not accessible.
Right. So, in fact, I have a generator. I've had this generator because I used to be a contractor, and
Right.
I would use it on the job site to run all my tools and everything.
And the compressor,
And an air compressor and all that. I still have that stuff. It's big, it's loud, it takes a lot of gasoline, but it works. And me, in my own, duh.
Yeah, we thought about this later.
This was a fail. About halfway through the time when the power was out, I all of a sudden I thought, I have a generator out there, and I didn't even think to get any gas for it. So, on the short term preps, it was a total failure for us. But for long term, which is what we're planning for, it really showed us, that we just can't rely on those things that need to have renewable.
Right. Someone I love very dearly has a complete house generator. And I've been there before when the power went out. And man, just a few moments go by and beam. It's not even that loud outside. And you've got power. And it's wonderful. But we were just talking recently, and she said that, that's great. They have huge propane tank for it. They have a good amount of propane for it. I don't know if it's a huge tank, but they have a good amount of propane for it. But she said 8 to 10 days, we'd be out of propane. And so the reality is, even though that was wonderful having that, it makes it feel like nothing's even changed. But in the long term, you eventually, she said after like 8 to 10 days, she'd be out of fuel. And then you've got to be able to deal with heat and everything else you need. The electricity and stuff without the generator.
So we have a neat little outline here of what we're going to talk about, and we are, look at this, getting completely ahead of ourselves. And
well, we did pretty good down to that, like there.
Yeah, well, we haven't started on this yet, but we've already talked about it, most of it.
But yeah.
So
you all understand,
yeah.
Right?
So for long term, which is, we said, like more than 10 days up to a year or more, basically most of the time it's going to be sudden and unexpected. You won't have any warning to be able to go and stock up on gasoline or water. It'll just happen. And when it does, we could have a total collapse of the infrastructure if the fuel is not available for trucks, if maybe there's electricity but you can't pay for it anymore, so they shut it off. I mean, who knows how that'll all work? I don't know. And short-term supplies like groceries, gasoline, propane, water that you bottle is no longer going to be available and you cannot resupply them when you run out.
Yeah, it's the resupplying that we have to really think about
Right.
when it's a longer scenario.
So that's why for our long-term preps, we are planning on things that we don't have to try to repurchase or resupply after a week.
Right.
So now this is where we've already talked about a lot of this. The water.
But that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. Freezer food. We mentioned that we lost the meat that we had frozen in the freezer, and a lot of people said, just put it in a cooler and put it outside. It's winter; it'll stay cold. If it's in the dead of winter, absolutely. I've done that before.
Oh yeah.
But this is March. It's not the dead of winter, and so it was going above freezing during the day. It would drop below, into the 20s or low 20s at night, and it would be above. It would be up into around 40 during the day. For those of you on what's the word? C.
Oh, Celsius.
Celsius. For those of you on Celsius, that's like 10 degrees above freezing. So if we did that, and some of you said, well, put it in your car or in your trunk or in the sunroom. Those were solar heated during the day, and it would have been, considerably warmer. So we would have a dangerous situation there where the food would start to thaw out during the day, and then it would freeze at night, and then it would start to thaw out the next day and freeze at night again, and that's dangerous to eat food that's been thawed and frozen and back and forth like that.
You can't use food that's been keeps getting frozen and like thawed and everything.
So if it was in the middle of January or February, we could have done that, but here in March with a spring storm, almost spring storm.
Yeah, it's trying to be spring.
That we really couldn't do that. So, but fortunately, because of our Thrive freeze-dried food, we didn't have much in the freezer. We had some salmon and we had a couple of hamburgers, and so as they started to thaw out, we just ate them.
We just used them.
So we didn't lose anything because we didn't have much in there.
And see, that is another really important long-term prepping thing. If someone's really relying on a lot of frozen food for long-term use, just realize that that's only going to be dependent on the electricity. I mean, the best chest freezer in the world that you don't open is eventually going to start to warm up if you can't keep it charging.
Right.
And so, keep it running. But so, we did okay because we have some freezer things. We don't, we do use meats and stuff that are not necessarily from Thrive, but we didn't have a ton of it, so we were able to use it, and we really didn't lose a lot of, meat and stuff. And of course, what we have with the freeze-dried isn't affected at all.
And if you've got a generator to keep your freezer running, once again, that's only going to be good as long as you have gasoline. As soon as you run out of gasoline, if you can't buy more, then you're still going to lose your freezer stuff.
Right.
So, yeah. Another thing that a lot of people talked about is, why are you worried about water? You got all the snow that you need out there. We actually addressed this in the video, but I want to talk about that again because it takes a huge amount of snow. If you haven't tried to do this, you don't really know.
Right, it's amazing.
It takes a huge amount of snow to make a little bit of water. It takes, you have about between 10 and 12 inches of snow, depending on how wet it is, to make 1 inch of water. So in an emergency situation, certainly you can do that.
So, if you need to drink,
right.
I
mean, yeah, in a real emergency where you're dying of thirst, certainly you can do that. But in a long-term situation where you're trying to get enough water to wash dishes and and things like that, it's just not a workable situation long term. It takes such a huge amount of energy and a huge amount of time to melt a half a gallon of water that it's just really not workable.
We enjoyed watching a BBC show about Alaska, about some different people, we watch it on Netflix, that live in Alaska, and so many times they're surrounded by snow and they're working really hard to chisel through to get to clean water out of a river or out of a lake. Right. And I've thought, well, why, they got a fire going in their little cabin, why can't they just melt snow? And now I realize how unrealistic it is to try to rely on melted snow.
None of those people that live in Alaska above the Arctic Circle, none of them melt snow for water. It's just not practical on a long-term basis. And
another thing you have to realize is that if you're truly in an emergency, this is kind of important to understand, but if you're truly in an emergency situation, the three priorities are going to be heat, water, and food. And you often think of water first, but when it's cold...
most people say food, water, and housing. It's exactly backwards. It needs to be heated housing, water, and food.
Right, some kind of shelter and warmth, water and food. And so you have to realize that eating snow or just using snow, unless you have a way to be warmed up, just lowers your body temperature like crazy. And it takes a lot of energy to melt snow, whether you're trying to do it indoors or you're trying to eat it or whatever. And so you have to make sure you have a good source of heat to even think about using snow for water. And you certainly can't use it for any other larger amounts of need.
Right.
It just takes too much snow.
And why is that? Since you brought that up, why is that priority? Housing, water, and snow. It's because if you're in the winter and you don't have a warm place to stay overnight, you could freeze to death overnight, literally. You can go for about 3 days without water, and you can go for weeks or even months without food. So heated housing or heated, a warm place to stay overnight is the most important, and then water, and then food.
Right. There's the three principle. You can go 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food.
Right.
So because melting snow was addressed a lot, we wanted to bring that up again. So.
Oh yeah. Awful lot of people also suggested that we get a car charger for our cell phones. We can just plug it into our car to charge the phones.
We've always had car chargers.
Sure, we have.
I mean, goodness, you go on they rattle around all over the place. But yeah, because on a trip, it's wonderful. Our new little bitty car is really cool. It has 2 places you could actually plug in a charger. So when we're going on a trip, visiting family or something like that, we can have both of our phones charging. So yeah, the car chargers are great.
But fortunately, we had a full tank of gas because the gas stations weren't open because there wasn't any electricity.
Yeah, we didn't have gas stations around
here. But we
here.
did drive several places. Like we drove to see my father. He lives 20 minutes away.
He's half hour.
Half hour away. But that wasn't enough to charge the phone all the way up. That only gave us maybe 10 or 15% on the charge as we drove for a half hour. And that was the longest trip that we took. Most of the other trips were only a mile or 2.
Right.
And that's just not enough time. So we would end up with the car just idling in the driveway to charge the phones. Now certainly we could have done that, but for a long-term situation that's not really workable either. We need to get something else, some kind of solar something, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, of course we know about car chargers. In emergencies we could have done that. But in a long-term situation, an EOW end of the world situation, are the cell towers even going to be working? And if they're not, then you don't even need cell phones. So in a long-term situation, that's kind of irrelevant anyway.
Well, and the thing of it is, anything where you're using gasoline, that's great as long as you have gasoline or propane,
So a lot of people obviously mentioned solar, and some of you were even surprised, how can you be preppers without solar? I heard some people say that.
Sure.
We absolutely agree. We like solar. We like the idea of solar. Up until now, it has not been on the top of our financial priority list. We do see that coming at some time in the future.
Absolutely.
Also possibly a wind generator, because we're up on top of a mountain here where we get a lot of wind.
It actually
for days that we don't have solar.
It actually just about never is completely still here.
Right.
So I actually have a friend her and her husband have a alternate energy company, and she was visiting with me, and she said, "Man, have you ever considered doing wind generation?" Because she noticed that the leaves never stopped moving on the trees. So that would be a definite consideration.
So, and many of you, if you have watched many of our videos, you know that we also bought this little travel trailer that's mobile, not like the one we live in here.
Yeah, it's actually a little travel trailer.
That we're hoping to start traveling in, and we want to get a solar system for that. And to tell you the truth, we'll probably get solar for that before we get solar for this, because we want to be able to boondock.
Right. And it gives us a good chance to work with it and start using it.
And learning more about it and all that.
Yes.
But like I said, up until now, it hasn't been a financial priority, so we don't have it yet. There are also a few problems with that, because up here, out west, solar is great. But here in the Northeast, we can get socked in for 5, 6, 7 days in a row, sometimes with low overhanging clouds, and there's going to be no solar power.
Well, that makes the solar a great thing for supplement, but you can't completely depend on always having it long term in terms of, but it's still a cool idea.
Having a wind generator and solar would help, You know, because if it's the sun's not shining, maybe the wind's blowing. You know. But another issue too is that I watch a lot of videos, channels from full-time RVers, and most of them have solar systems in their RVs. And
which is so cool.
I've seen 3 or 4 of them say, yeah, after a year, their solar controlling panel went up, and they had to replace it. So you know you're relying on technology, and that's great, but technology breaks down, and unless you have spare parts stored, which I suppose we could,
A lot of spare parts stored.
I tend to like to have old-time analog mechanical devices to rely on if all the technology wears down.
Well, you know, if we're really looking at long term, you know, if you end up in a situation where you can't replace those parts, you know, what would you have for an alternative?
Right.
You know, and so that's what we're talking about with long term stuff that is just good old fashioned, going to kind of always be there, like building that little rocket stove and finding twigs. You know, you don't have to worry about replacing technical parts. That's
Right.
just
You know, we have a propane stove. That'll be our first choice to cook on. We have a wood stove to heat our house. That would be our second choice to cook on. But that little rocket stove is a third choice, and it's always there because there's always twigs. And it's, you know, it's a third line of defense, if you will.
right.
But it's always there. We know that we always know how to cook. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, a simple thing, and if you know how to do it, then one way or another, you're going to always be able to have a little bit of a fire.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. I do have some, you know, people talk a lot about making sure we have stuff for entertainment.
Yeah.
You know,
when I talked about
we address that.
I was bored out of my mind because I couldn't read my book on my Kindle. You know.
So when we do have some books left, we just couldn't keep very many of them. I actually love board games. Bill is a crack
Yeah.
up.
This is how I spell board games.
So, but yeah, it's a good idea. And of course, with having kids growing up, we always had lots of board games around and stuff with them. We do have some cards. You know, we just have to find ways to keep ourselves kind of occupied. You know, during the darker times of the evening when you're relying on different softer lights and it's adaptable. You know, we just want you to know that we do realize that that's a very good idea.
Yeah, we might possibly get a chess set. I could do chess.
Yeah,
But
chess.
you've only played a half a dozen games in your life, I think.
Yeah, but if you taught me, you'd be in for it.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, chess would be really fun. So, and there's all sorts of card games a person can play. So, yeah.
So, what did we learn from that storm? I think we really learned for the first time the difference between short-term prepping and long-term prepping. I mean, at least in my mind, I never really made a differentiation between them.
Right. Yeah.
And now I understand the difference. And I understand now that almost all of our preps were long-term, and we neglected the short-term. Most of the short-term preps you do the day or two before the emergency comes up. And we just hadn't been thinking along those lines. So now,
And we did fine.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
sure, we did fine. But now I have that dialed in, and next time a big storm comes up, I'm going to maybe fill a couple of pots full of water before the storm hits.
And remember that we do have a generator. And
Right.
I forgot all about the thing. We haven't used it in so long.
Well, so did I. Like I said, halfway through the time when we had no power, all of a sudden I went, I got a generator sitting out there in the shed, but I don't have any gas to put in it. I didn't even think about it.
And we're not going to siphon it out of the car, guys. For one thing, I think we need it in the car. Anyway.
So
I hate
and
siphoning. Bleh.
we also know that we still have a few holes in our system.
Yes.
We don't really have any way to do laundry. We've talked about this before, but
Yeah,
unless
we're
we
still trying to work on getting that squared
put it
away.
in a 5-gallon bucket and push it up and down with a plunger, you know.
And then, you know, people are going to make good suggestions about that, and we know that there are very good, really like off-the-grid washing things that you can get that are
I've seen
small.
little ones that you can crank by hand and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, you know, I can just make Bill go down to the river and slap him against a rock or
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Slap them against the ice.
Yeah, slap against the ice, right? Yeah.
And the sewer, as long as we have water to pour into the tank for the toilet, we can flush the toilet. But long term, we're not on a septic system. We're on a city sewer system. Long term, I have no idea what that means. Is
Yeah.
it all gravity going down into their, place where they reclaim the water? or do they have to have pumps to pump it up and down the hills? Will it back up into our toilet? Well, if it's going to back up into our toilet, it wouldn't happen just because we're using it, but because the whole community is still using it.
Right.
So we'll use it as long as we can, but that's another area that we know that we have a hole in our system. It would be possible to get a my brain's not working.
Yeah. What do they call them? We see them all the time, and they look really interesting. You know,
composting
toilet. Oh goodness.
And you can even make
a composting
toilet just with a 5-gallon bucket and a plastic bag, but you know that's.
Yeah, we know
there are some issues with that.
Yeah, and we know that we want to get that kind of resolved in terms of, in a long-term thing, what would be the best, safest way for us to deal with that. So that's something that's an ongoing,
right.
Thought for us, because I mean, in reality, you would have to deal with that, So.
Is that about it?
Yeah, I think so. We just reminded me of a really cool thing that I saw, where this person said, "I am so proud of myself. I just walked into a room and did not forget what I went in there for." Of course, it was the bathroom, but Oh,
if you're older than 50, you'll probably understand that.
Yeah, you will. And if you're not older than 50, you'll be like, "What are you talking about?" Oh goodness, forgetting stuff is like, whoa. Okay.
So for us, prepping is a journey.
Absolutely.
And we learn every time. We take every opportunity we can to learn, like the recent storm where we lost power. And so thank you for coming along on the journey with us and for making the suggestions that you do.
Yes.
And hopefully you're learning along with us. We learn from you, you learn from us.
Yep.
That's what this is all about.
It's just we've really wanted to make sure that all of us think about what would we really need to do if this situation extended itself. Are you really going to be okay? And what do you have in mind in terms of water, in terms of having some food around, and of course having shelter. And I think especially when you live in a cold climate, so we just don't want to think we have this all figured out and not think it through, I guess is what I'm really saying. Yeah.
So a while ago, year and a half ago, something like that, we did a video series. I think it was actually 3 series called How to Start Prepping. And if you've never thought about it and you don't know how to start, we gave you a lot of pointers of how to actually start. So I will put a link at the end of this video to that one, as well as the one about getting water from the from the river.
And we keep coming across really nifty things that we want to keep sharing with you guys, like those Lucy lights.
Yep.
Anything we can share with you that's just a handy thing to have around, whether it's a short term or long term,
Right.
And handy things in the kitchen, and can you open up a can if you don't have electricity? Things like that.
Yep. Oh no, I got all these candles and I didn't have any matches.
I have all these cans of food and I have no can opener.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming along with us.
Yeah.
And if you've learned anything from this, if you've enjoyed this, please like the video. Help us a lot.
Yeah.
And if you want to continue in our journey of learning how to prep, then subscribe and you can get all of our life lessons of prepping in the future.
Along with a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, a bunch of other stuff as well.
All righty.
Okay, thank you very much everybody. We love you guys.
I love you. Yep. Spring is coming. Yay! All right. Bless you.
Yeah, be blessed.
Bye-bye.